These two traits average a 2.62 when played together. Normally, when something has this low of a placement, it is dependent on some high roll situation. 7 Syndicate, which is pretty strong, requires 2 emblems, and still has an average placement of 3.11. What's the high roll needed for this combo? You need to hit level 9 and find 1 Kobuko. That's it. With Ziggs shipping down the entire frontline for Veigar to finish off, with 6 Bastion stalling an incredible amount of time, capping around both Kobuko and Renekton's strong single target DPS, this comp has it all. Now, despite what it looks like, this is not a reroll comp. For how simple it is to get to what is statistically an incredible result, there has to be more to it, right? After playing a bunch of games on it myself, it's not that easy, but it's very strong if you do hit. Hi, I'm STheHero. I'm the closest thing there is to a professional theory crafter for TFT. This set I've been incredibly active in comp making and moving the meta forward. Today I want to talk about a comp that absolutely no one is playing, but is definitely a hidden threat to look out for. If you want to see more content like this, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more. So what exactly is it that makes this comp so powerful? Patch 14.4 introduced many buffs to this comp that make it much more stable in the early game and much powerful in the late game. The first one to mention are the buffs to Veigar, Alawi, and Shyvana, as these are the crux of our early game strategy. Additionally, the buffs to 6 Bastion helps with stabilizing on level 8. And finally, with all the buffs that Renekton received, you have another strong carry you can cap your board with alongside Kobuko and your 2 backliners. To really break it down, let's go over the items, augments, and general playstyle of this comp. One of the most important elements of this comp is to not be greedy with items, and to just make any good items that you can. I have a rough item tier list for what you should prioritize for this comp. As you can see, I have a lot of items stacked into the S tier, and that's because I want to emphasize that you really don't need to greed for any items in particular. The moment you can make anything from that S tier, you should. Any AP caster items go onto Veigar, and any bruisery items go onto Shyvana. Shyvana's holding items for an eventual Kobuko. Veigar can hold items for Ziggs, but ideally you're able to itemize both backliners if possible, as Veigar 2 is an incredibly strong part of the comp. In general, you want to avoid pure tank items and AD items, so if those are your only options, you may want to consider playing something else. And even though you will have a Renekton in the late game, his item shouldn't be a priority until you actually have him. Now let's briefly go over augments. I'm not going to go over everything, but the general game plan is to take a good econ augment early and to look for good item or combat augments later. Some augments to look out for are the 2 Cyberbuff augments, Quality over Quantity, Lucky Gloves, Preparation, Cloning Facility, Ascension, Starry Night, Transistor, Anger Issues, Sponging, Void Swarm, Scoped Weapons, Button Mash, and again, most good econ augments. Cower Weaklings is just an overpowered combat augment that this comp can abuse as it plays around Cyberboss. New High Score post-nerf is essentially an econ augment, but that's pretty good, as it helps you get to 9 faster and it also guarantees you both a Ziggs and a Kobuko. Quality over Quantity is really good in comps with the vertical tank trait, because of how good radiant utility items are, like Redemption, Sunfire, Ionic Spark, Static Shiv, and Gunblade. And also, because we're not picky on the itemization, you can just slam a lot of these onto the other Bastion units, and this also opens up the option to have these tank items that you otherwise wouldn't build, as the radiant versions are much more powerful, and are otherwise going onto units that wouldn't normally be itemized. Lucky Gloves is quite similar in that we aren't picky with itemization, so it's just an easy way to itemize Kobuko, Renekton, the backliners, whatever ones you're struggling to find items for, especially after the item drop nerf. Preparation augments are pretty good combat options, as they synergize really well with the comp, and it's pretty easy to play around, just like automatically. They also happen to be buffed on the patch. Cloning Facility is really good with Kobuko, as he doesn't have a mana cost, and doesn't really get affected by the health debuff. It's also okay on Renekton and Sejuani. Ascension is just really good with vertical tank traits. Starry Night is interesting because you still don't want to reroll and you want to push levels. You don't want to get baited and mess up your econ early on, but this augment can help you end the late game with Veigar 3 and maybe some of the other 1 and 2 costs. But make sure you don't grief your econ by going for too many at the same time. For reference, at level 9, the odds of finding a 1 or 2 cost as a 2-star is 90%, meaning you just need to find one of the units in your shop twice to pretty much guarantee a 3-star for free. Now I want to talk about Transistor, because it has a reputation for being a pretty terrible augment, and in most cases it still is. The problem with this augment is that most of the Bastion units only use the AP well, and the purpose of these units is just to be tanky for the first 10 seconds anyway. If you do stumble upon a Bastion emblem then this augment can be considered, as it's no longer just a Renekton augment, but possibly a Kobuko augment as well. Without an emblem, I would not take this augment. Anger Issues is another one that's surprisingly good in this comp because the Bastions help the Ginsu's users ramp up. Kobuko also uses this really well as he has the built-in healing. Renekton will miss not having healing, but otherwise is really good with these Ginsus as well. And then of course, Ziggs and Veigar, while not typically Ginsu's users, can still do very well given that the Ginsus have self-synergy and stack with each other. And with all the Bastions and stall you have in your frontline, you'll have a lot of time to ramp. And they're pretty much still better than actual AP items. Sponging can be really good early game to duplicate frontline items like Redemption or Crown Guard onto the rest of the tanks, and then whatever backline items you have onto the other backliner. Void's Form benefits from 6 Bastion, which is just a lot of extra value, similar to how it benefits from Divinicore. One thing to consider though is that your frontline might be a little bit cluttered with all the extra Bastions and the Voidlings, so just be careful with your positioning. A funny augment to consider in this comp is Scoped Weapons. I don't know if it's really good, but it's definitely takeable. You obviously have Renekton who uses this well. Kobuko in theory can use this okay, but you lose the value on his cast, and it may not work well depending on his items, so generally I wouldn't put him in the backline. However, another unit that does benefit a lot from this augment is Ziggs, and the reason is because of how his spell targets. The bomb explodes where it can hit the most units, but it's limited to Ziggs' range. With Scoped Weapons, Ziggs will always target the max amount of units possible, which is essentially just a DPS increase overall. The last augment I want to talk about is Button Mash, which is Poppy's hero augment. This augment is really good, and it's probably the main reason why these two traits have their stats inflated when played together, as getting to 9 while playing around this comp is pretty hard to do. When I came up with this strategy, I didn't consider this augment at all and why the stats looked the way they did. I just happened to stumble upon success while playing this comp completely without it. I'm pretty sure if you do hit the augment, you do want to play around the Poppy 3-star before pushing levels and just play the comp kinda normally. All that said, I'm not actually sure if it's better to just not take this augment and push levels or to take the augment. I have not seen this augment in a long time, but from what I've heard and from what I've seen, this augment is just pretty good right now. If you do hit the augment, you can probably just play around the hero augments like normal and then just push levels like normal. Now, let's talk about the game plan. The general gameplay structure is to use the early strength of these units to save a lot of health and just go for a fast level 9. This comp is best played from a win streak position and on high econ portals like Scuttle Puddle. Stage 2, you're playing around whatever random upgraded units you hit while holding onto Bastion units and onto Veigar. You really want to try to win streak, so make sure to slam any good item you have onto a good holder. On Carousel, you probably want to look for a tier or a rod, but usually you're just trying to make sure you can complete an item from the component you get. Ideally, you have 2 completed items after the Carousel. On Stage 3, you want to continue whatever you're doing. If you were win streaking, you can look to level 6 early, otherwise you can level to 6 on the standard interval at 3-2. Now, what's pretty important here is that you're not poor and you don't have terrible items. Assuming that's true, you want to roll a little bit for Veigar 2 and some frontline upgrades. The board you're trying to stabilize on is 4 Bastion plus Veigar plus another filler unit, maybe another techie. At this point you really can't afford to bleed that much, and if you hit, you're very likely to win streak throughout Stage 3. On Stage 4, you want to scout for one thing, which is how contested Sejuani is going to be. I say this because I had a game where I was poor and literally every Sejuani was gone before 4-2, and I was very lucky that I already had a Bastion emblem to get 6 Bastion. Generally, you want to level to 8 on 4-2, but if you see more than 2 other Sedge players, you want to level early and roll for 6 Bastion and maybe a Ziggs. When I say roll for 6 Bastion, I mean literally just hit 1 copy of Sejuani. If you've been winning most fights at that point, that's literally all you need to be stable. So by this point, the board you're looking for is 6 Bastion plus Veigar, plus maybe a Ziggs / whatever filler unit you have. If you have that, you can probably still win some fights. You should be expecting to bleed a little bit, but this board is surprisingly stable and you can win some fights still. And in your losses, you're probably not going to lose by that many units because Veigar is kind of a beast. The plan is to go 9 with enough gold to roll for a Kobuko, whether that be on 5-1 or a little earlier if you're rich and high rolling. The moment you hit all 4 Cyberboss, you want to put it in and make sure that Kobuko is the Cyberboss, because even though all the units get the upgrades on their abilities, only one gets the stats, which is why it's really important to have 3 items for Kobuko early. If you find a Renekton, you can replace Jax, or in some rare cases Alawi, depending on your emblems and item situation. By stage 5, you want to have a 3-item Kobuko and a 3-item one of your backliners. I say that because Veigar 2 is really good at killing units and is honestly comparable to Ziggs, just depending on the matchups. But from here on out, you're just looking to upgrade all your units, and you shouldn't even consider going 10 until you do. And again, there's no real reason to be greedy with what items you have, just 3-item Kobuko, 3-item Ziggs, and then some other items onto Veigar and onto Renekton. With good enough items, augments, and positioning, you can actually beat out some of the most capped boards, such as a capped Boombot board or capped Cypher boards. Now let's talk about matchups and positioning. I'd say this comp is pretty well rounded and has pretty good matchups across the board. I think one particularly good matchup is against Street Demon, because in most cases, Brand and Ziggs can't get through your frontline, so you only really lose to Samir 2 Kobuko 2, and that's only if they hit before you hit your own upgrades. There's also some Street Demon formations that are particularly vulnerable to the Sedge Kobuko Ziggs combo. Against other forecast boards, you're usually okay as well, as Veigar still gets his true damage against forecast tanks. I would say what this comp struggles with the most is comps playing around 3-cost 3-star tanks with Dragon Claw, such as Galio or Braum. The reason for this is because Veigar is your best tool to deal with tanks. If they're 3-star, he loses his bonus true damage, and they're also tank gear, and the rest of your board can't really deal with them that quickly. A lot of the time, these comps have these 3-star 3-cost solo frontline, and if that's the case, one workaround is to try to get Kobuko or Renekton to wrap onto the backline, which is a good way you can cheese a win against some of those matchups. Generally, position is pretty nuanced because there's a lot of different tech for each of the units. The first thing is obviously to try to get a good Sedge stun off on one of the two sides. I think the next priority is to get good Kobuko value. I like putting him in the center of the front line, as he still takes damage to get to his second form pretty early on, but it's generally safer there than in the other frontline spots, and usually has good AoE value. You do want to be mindful about enemy carries targeting from the start of combat, usually a Zeri, and the reason is if they have their carry in the center backline hex, as they will just start hitting him from the beginning, and he can't really do anything about that. To deal with this, if I see one of those in my pool, I'll usually leave a gap in the center of my frontline and move Kobuko 1 hex back. I like having Galio as my preferred tank to place on the opposite side of Sejuani, as he's just the best overall tank remaining. For Renekton, you generally want to have him bite something, it doesn't really matter what, and you want to have him wrap around your front line, preferably on the same side of Sejuani. In addition, Ziggs and Veigar also have positioning nuances. Ziggs' spell targeting makes it so that he likes being placed close to the center of the backline, as it increases the odds of his bomb hitting the most units possible. However, in some cases, you want to actually put him on the same side as the enemy carry, especially against Vex boards. The reason for this is that the bigger plus shape of the upgraded Cyberboss spell checks the backline, which means that you're more likely to hit the backliner. In the case of Vex, her damage is lowered from all that chip, and against other carries that don't have healing, you can also cheese them by just continuously splashing onto them. For Veigar, you usually just want to target the enemy main tank. Against 3-star tanks, you may want to put the Veigar on the opposite side and have him work the other way. This way, you have a good chance that Renekton or Kobuko will start hitting the backline instead of getting stuck onto the tank. With all that, you should have enough to start finding success with this comp. I've had a lot of fun playing around with this comp, especially since I can properly claim this one, as for once it hasn't gotten yoinked before I finish the guide like with most other comps. Regardless, if you do want to see the birth of new comps like this, the places to look would be live on my stream or on my website. If you like the guide, once again, I'll ask you to like the video and subscribe. It really means a lot. Also, feel free to let me know how much LP you gained or lost in the comments, as it helps out with the YouTube algorithm. Anyway, thanks for watching.